Hello, well, welcome to the now almost annual History of Science lecture that is brought by the Emeriti Association. I'm Eli Silver, and I'm president of the Emeriti Association. And the History of Science lecture was set up to honor Michael Nauenberg. And I'll say a few words about Michael. He was born to a secular Jewish family in Berlin in 1934. And in 1939, his family escaped Germany for obvious reasons and moved to Columbia. Michael then moved to the US. He got his degree in physics at Cornell, working for Hans Bethe. And from then until 1966, he was at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, he was at Columbia University, Stanford University, and then in 1966 became a professor of physics at UCSC. He played a crucial role in the development of the physics department and was also instrumental in developing both Stevenson and Crown colleges. Since the 1990s, he published numerous works on the history of science, and he focused on Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, Christian Huygens. When Michael passed away in 2019, the Emeriti Association and the Nauenberg family established a History of Science lecture series in his honor. Tonight's lecture is the fourth in that series. Michael was really interested in developing a history of science program at UCSC, and I'm pleased to say that the campus now has several outstanding historians of science, and one such historian is Jennifer Derr, who will talk to us tonight on world wounds, the damming of the Nile River and the transformation of medicine. And to introduce Jennifer, I'd like to call on Jenny Reardon, who's a professor of sociology and was the founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center.
Good evening, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jennifer Derr, the Associate Professor of History here at UC Santa Cruz. But by way of introduction, I'm going to continue with there's many histories in this room. I've been really taking that in here. But by way of introduction, I want to first say a few words about the history of science so that I can situate Professor Derr's work and the remarkable contributions she has made to the field. So what is the history of science and why should you care? On one account, and this is only one account, it started in Western elite universities like Harvard in the US and Cambridge in the United Kingdom by scientists like James Bryant Conant, an organic chemist who during World War I developed poison gas in 1933, became president of Harvard, and during the World War II, chaired the National Defense Research Council, and in that role oversaw the Manhattan Project. Now, as president of Harvard, Conant decided that he revamped the university's general education requirements, and he made history of science one of those requirements. Given its world transformational powers, he believed everyone should learn science and they could learn it through studying the history. And for Conant, the science was a march of progress. One idea logically leads to another, and the world progresses. And he wanted all to know this. Until a bomb drops and instantaneously kills out tens of thousands of people. Now, Vannevar Bush, an electrical engineer and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's science policy advisor during World War II, argued that the dropping of the atomic bomb actually created peace and meant that fewer people died than if the bomb had not dropped. And most were happy to just accept that story. I mean, the war had ended, so why shouldn't the world just be happy? But an important group of people, some of the very ones who had created that bomb, were not. And others began to scratch their heads. Was it really true that more people would have died if it had not been for the atomic bomb, as Bush had argued? That might have been his story, but should it be our story? And then another war started, the Cold War, and more people began to scratch their heads. Why, they asked, was it that so much so-called basic science was being funded by the military on topics of interest to the military? Why were scientists at elite universities, like Harvard University's chemist Louis Pfizer, creating things like napalm and strapping devices with that fiery liquid onto bats and setting them out loose into the world? Now, of course, we have drones, so much better, so progress. And why were scientists so passionate about debating the links between IQ, race, and genetics, and many arguing for the intellectual superiority of those who were white and from the West? Some of the people who had been scratching their heads now began to organize. Some of those scientists created Science for the People. They collaborated with many others who argued that they weren't buying this story that all science was about was one idea that led to another, that led to progress. And they wanted to shine some light on what was really going on in those laboratories and have some accountability on the acts of what they began to describe as a scientific technocracy that seemed to be taking over government and our worlds. And in the late 1980s and early 90s, universities and governments actually began to cede a little bit to this argument, and they began to fund something called the social studies of science. But then some scientists began to balk. They're like, who are these people who think they can understand science who aren't scientists, who are doing social studies of science? Some physicists, for example, were upset. They saw the funding in their field decreasing, and they thought it might be because of what they called these imposter intellectuals. So it was into this rather unpleasant milieu of what became known as the science wars that myself and Jennifer Derr decided we would set out to think about this world and to start our academic careers. It wasn't a particularly easy time to start. How could one respond to these now very heated contestations over science? For those of you who think that this all started last year, I'm here to tell you it did not. And it's scholars like Jennifer Derr who started to chart a sane and responsible path through the trouble. And here I'm riffing on a scholar who's inspired so many of us who's here with us tonight, Donna Haraway. So to those who said, you don't know the science, Derr said, well, I will know the science. At Stanford University, Jennifer Derr studied and received her bachelor's of science in biology, and she worked in a cancer biology lab, studying tumor suppressor genes. And as I'm sure you're going to find out tonight, she retains her passion for the sciences and her keen interest in biology and pathology. I've learned a lot from her about microbiology and about the pathology. To those concerned that the history of science had been told as great men hagiography, Derr said, look, let's just not focus on any humans, let alone men, but rather let's pay attention to the materiality of the science. Let's not place a Copernicus or Darwin at the center of the story, but rather that which historically has been held up as the seat of human feeling and courage, that vital organ, the liver. Derr introduced the liver as a central historical actor in her first award-winning book, which I meant to bring to the stage, The Lived Nile, Environment, Disease, and Material Colonial Economy in Egypt. The award-winning book, I should note. In Derr's new book, The Organ That Traveled the World, Medicine, Capitalism, and the Environment, and the Environmental Body, a little of which we will hear about tonight, the liver is also a central character. Indeed, is a central character. And for those concerned that the history of science had been told by and for those in the West, Derr said, let's situate our understanding elsewhere. Our understanding of the liver not in the West, but in the Middle East. While Jennifer Derr is a historian of science, she is also an expert on the Middle East. She received a master's in contemporary Arab studies from Georgetown. She is fluent in Arabic, and much of her research was conducted in the Middle East, reading texts in Arabic. And she's brought that expertise here as the founding director of our Center for Middle East and North African Studies. Derr has brought her understanding of the Middle East, particularly of Egypt, also to an exploration of what happens when perhaps its most significant ecology, that of the Nile River, becomes the intense focus of the dreams of engineers, capitalists, and political authorities. What happens to human courage and feeling, to human pain, when new biologies and ecologies are created by placing 14 million cubic meters of earth and rock in the middle of the world's largest river? What happens to the bodies of humans and the bodies of knowledge? How does rock and rubble and human labor make and remake livers, and how do these livers, in turn, reshape their human hosts and their ways of knowing, living, and dying? In the histories of science that Derr writes, biology, politics, environments, histories, different parts of the world are all entangled in one another. We are brought into stories where it's not possible to imagine that a place like Egypt is another world in another time, a place of pharaohs and mummies, as we're taught in too many museums. It is our present, a place of relations in which we are all entangled, a place where we come to know the world a bit more intimately, a place where we learn about science and nature, yes, but not as some caricatured version of them designed to venerate elites or those in power, but as they actually exist entangled in our ways of living and dying. These are stories by which we might find better ways to live with the messy, lively, and deadly entanglements that are so pressing upon us today and that make us. And I look forward to inhabiting them tonight. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome my wonderful and dynamic colleague, Jennifer Derr, to the stage.
I want to thank Jenny for that robust and very generous introduction. That was wonderful, Jenny. And I also want to thank all of you who have come here to join me this evening. It's such a privilege and also an honor to deliver tonight's Nauenberg Lecture in the History of Science. Michael Nauenberg led a kind of storied life, a life that historians write about and that fellow scholars view as an inspiration. He was the child of scientists. Both of his parents were researchers in infectious disease. He was also a child of genocide. His grandmother was killed at Auschwitz. His parents fled Germany for Columbia. While holding this tragedy close, I would like to begin tonight with the legacy of his intellectual spirit, his love for science, and also his love for learning in all of its forms. He also had a sense that in addition to doing science, it was vital that we understand its place in the world. And I'm here tonight to speak in that spirit. Before beginning, I want to say that I have been incredibly fortunate to teach at UC Santa Cruz since 2012. At this institution, I have found inspiration from many of you who are sitting in this audience. I have found support for my work, and I have also found copious joy. In particular, I want to acknowledge the intellectual and social communities that exist around the Center for the Middle East and North Africa, the Science and Justice Research Center, the Center for Cultural Studies, and also my colleagues in the History Department and in the Humanities Division more broadly. I begin tonight with the story of a star. In Egypt, in the middle decades of the 20th century, few were as well known and as beloved as the singer and actor Abdel Halim Hafez. Halim, as he was known by those who held him close, so all of Egypt, was Egypt's nightingale. He was its king of romance. He was its son of the revolution. What is most remarkable about his stardom is the humble place from which it began. Halim was born in 1929 in the province of Sharqiya in the eastern portion of the Nile Delta. His mother died hours after his birth, his father 5 years later. Now, in the period that stretched between World War I and World War II, to be a member of the Egyptian rural working class was to live a life that was marked by dramatic social inequality and grinding poverty. Halim lived this life. Fatefully, Egypt's Nightingale was raised by an older brother, a struggling music teacher. Halim attended the High Arab Music Institute in Cairo, and when he graduated, he began to perform. His life, like that of many Egyptians, was transformed in 1952 when a group of junior military officers seized control of the Egyptian state and formed a new regime that was animated by a revolutionary and anti-colonial nationalism. Abdul Halim Hafez became the poetic voice of that sentiment. He was, during the 1950s and 1960s, a voice of resilience. He was the voice of promise. Tragically, Halim's ascent had its limits. He would never quite escape the bodily marks of an impoverished countryside. When he was in his 20s, Halim was diagnosed with a severe case of the parasitic disease schistosomiasis. He had been infected with the disease as a child in the countryside, as many children were. While he received treatment, the damage that schistosomiasis caused, it acquired a momentum of its own. In 1977, before he reached his 50th birthday, Abdul Halim Hafez died in a London hospital, his death caused by the symptoms of the liver disease that was one manifestation of schistosomiasis. Now, despite his celebrity, there was nothing unique nor surprising in Halim's final act. When he was a child in the 1930s, more than 60% of the Egyptian population was infected with schistosomiasis. They became infected with the parasite through the forms of everyday environmental contact that came with life and work in the countryside. Halim's illness was also likely complicated by infection with the hepatitis C virus. Beginning in the 1930s, millions of Egyptians were infected with hepatitis C through unsterile medical procedures and blood transfusions. After hepatitis C was identified in 1989, it became clear that more Egyptians, as a proportion of the population, were infected with the virus than in any country in the world. By the early 2000s, roughly 10% of Egyptians were infected, and in the countryside, that prevalence could reach as high as 24%. Now, my talk today takes as its object the common wound that was liver disease in the middle decades of the 20th century in Egypt. This liver disease was caused by overlapping infections of hepatitis C and schistosomiasis. However, the characteristics of this wound were not only caused by disease. This wound was made more severe by the damage that resulted from the chemical compounds that were used to treat schistosomiasis, and in those infected, and also in the environments in which they lived. Finally, this form of injury, it was made by place, it was made by economics, and it was made by politics. Tonight, I'll explore three linked historical transformations: that of the environment, that of the body, and that of medicine. To do that, we are going to travel together through an arc of Egyptian history. In following this arc, I will make the strong argument that our bodies are historically specific, as are many of the injuries from which we suffer. Where we live, how we interact with the world around us, the forms of violence that we suffer, all of these processes can wound the body, sometimes in conjunction with disease. Wounds are made by pathogens. They are also made by race, class, and gender, and by geography, politics, and the structure of the economy. All of our bodies, they function as archives of historical change. I would like to offer a few words concerning my approach to research. The history that I will explore with you derives from a much larger book project. The research for this book project has, in the way of historians, spanned years, and it's been collected at an array of different archives located in Egypt, throughout Europe, and also in the United States. I've also conducted many interviews. I want to emphasize, in the face of where we are now, that the work of historians is impossible without language. My knowledge of Arabic is one of the most important skills that I utilize in my work and in my encounters that comprise that work. Since 1996, Egypt has been a place where I have studied. It was a place where I became a scholar. It has also been the world of my everyday life for long stretches of time. The research that I'll speak about today began not through an internet search or from a news article, but with the early death of a dear friend's brother. I begin with the environment. In Egypt, the history of the parasitic disease schistosomiasis is that of the damming of the Nile River. It is also that of colonial capitalism. Egypt was a British colony from 1882 until 1923. The British continued to exercise a strong hand in the country during the quasi-independent monarchy of the interwar period. When the British occupied Egypt, they were keen to increase the production of cotton, most of which was exported to textile mills in the north of England. In 1902, the first large dam was completed on the Nile River near the town of Aswan in Egypt's deep south. This dam, Khazen Aswan, enabled year-round agricultural production in some parts of the country. It also made widespread cotton cultivation possible. Cotton was the fuel for Egypt's colonial economy. In the period that stretched between the end of the late 19th century and the 1950s, Egypt was the province of a landed elite whose wealth was made through cash crop agriculture. The rural poor, whose members included Abdul Halim Hafez, worked their estates as sharecroppers and as wage laborers. The dam that I just described is perhaps not the dam that comes to mind when you think about the Nile River. That dam is the Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970. The politics attached to the High Dam were, in some ways, quite different than those of the first Nile Dam. While both structures sought to secure Egyptian hegemony on the Nile, the High Dam was built to support an independent future for post-colonial Egypt. Its politics were those of revolutionary nationalism. In 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers seized control of the Egyptian state. Nasser served as Egypt's president from 1954 until his death in 1970. His regime was revolutionary and anti-colonial in its rhetoric. It was authoritarian in its practice. A new dam, one that produced hydroelectricity, was seen as crucial to the construction of a larger Egyptian industrial sector and also to the modernization of Egyptian agriculture. Its symbolic value only intensified after the Suez Canal was nationalized, Egypt was attacked, and Nasser rose triumphant from the ashes of the 1956 Suez Crisis. During the 1960s, when construction was underway, the High Dam came to represent the totality of Egypt's political aspirations. The oft-repeated phrase, "after the dam," was a promise and a reassurance. The dam was independence and prosperity. It was the negation of Egypt's colonial past. The two dams might have been associated with very different forms of politics, but their impact on Egypt's agricultural ecology was similar. Egyptian agriculture is concentrated in the Nile Delta and in the Nile Valley. For millennia, this agriculture had been nourished by the annual Nile flood. The flood arrived each year in the late summer. Its waters were channeled into large basins where they soaked and fertilized the soil. Crops were planted in these basins after water was evacuated. During the season of the flood, villages stood as tiny islands in a vast aqueous landscape. Agricultural wealth came in the form of crops like wheat that could be cultivated according to the temporalities of the Nile flood. The damming of the Nile River transformed the material landscape of agriculture. When the first dam was complete in 1902, Egyptian laborers excavated vast networks of irrigation canals throughout the Nile Delta and in the northern half of the Nile Valley. These canals carried water stored by the dam to crops. They also facilitated year-round agricultural production. When crops needed water, farmers spent long portions of the day, knee or thigh deep in canals, hoisting this water to higher ground. The lyrics of one popular song, recorded in the early years of the 20th century, read, "I tremble like a leaf, looking at the stalk of the shadoof," a popular irrigation implement. "I am weary, my hands are bruised on the wood of the stalk of the shadoof. I am weary, I am weary." And this is the shadoof that's pictured in this photo. In addition to their role in agriculture, irrigation canals also became central features of village life. Approaching the Nile could be treacherous, especially when the Nile ran high and fast during the flood. Canals became places where women collected water and washed clothes. Children played in these canals, especially in the scorched days of summer. When the high dam was complete, canals were dug throughout Egypt, and year-round agricultural production became the norm. In 1964, the Nile River flooded for the last time in Egypt. The seasons of rest and work that had attached to the flood, the sense of anticipation that marked the time before its arrival, the smell and the taste of a flooded landscape, all of this was no more. The bodies of those who worked the land and lived in the countryside were fundamentally changed by the damming of the Nile. Canals watered crops and supported rural communities. They were also sites where disease was transmitted, schistosomiasis in particular. Schistosomiasis is a parasitic disease that relies on tiny freshwater snails as its vectors. Two species of schistosoma parasites are present in Egypt. Schistosoma hematobium and Schistosoma mansoni both cause fatigue, fever, aching, cough, and diarrhea in the weeks after infection. Those suffering from hematobium commonly have blood in their urine, and chronic infections can lead to cancer of the bladder. The long-term symptoms of mansoni include high blood pressure through the liver, an enlarged spleen, the buildup of fluid in the abdomen, and swollen areas in the esophagus and digestive tract that can rupture and bleed. Importantly, mansoni can also cause liver damage, in which excessive connective tissue, or fibrosis, builds up. This can lead to cirrhosis, liver failure, and liver cancer. In 20th century Egypt, it was this liver disease that was the most potent legacy of schistosomiasis. One becomes infected with schistosomiasis when their unbroken skin comes into contact with fresh water that contains both the schistosoma parasite and the snails that serve as its intermediate host. Schistosoma parasites begin their lives as eggs suspended in human feces or urine. Urine and feces containing these schistosoma eggs were released into canal water through the process of labor and also daily life. When expelled into water, eggs hatch and release free-swimming larvae that penetrate the feet of tiny freshwater snails. Irrigation canals were lush with vegetation. This vegetation supported thriving populations of snails. Within snails, schistosoma parasites develop before emerging in an organismal form that can penetrate our skin and also cause an infection. While rural communities as a whole fell prey to the parasite, children and also men who labored in agriculture were especially vulnerable. During the 1930s, the Rockefeller Foundation performed a nationwide survey of the prevalence of schistosomiasis in Egypt. The parasitologist who conducted this survey, James Alan Scott, determined that approximately 60% of Egypt's population was infected with at least one of the two parasites that caused the disease. Rates of infection could be as high as 90% in areas of the country where irrigation canals had first been dug. Not only was the prevalence high, in the early 20th century, patients began to present with extreme symptoms that had not been seen before by physicians. Many were infected with both species of the parasite. Farmers also suffered the effects of repeat infections, especially caused by the contact produced by labor. Now, Scott's survey also suggested what rates of infection would have been before the construction of Khazen S1. In regions of Egypt that had not been converted to year-round agriculture, where there were no canals, the prevalence of disease hovered at around 5%. Moreover, it is hypothesized that many of those who would have been infected in childhood were likely able to clear the disease from their system. The construction of dams and the emergence of an agricultural landscape consisting of canals produced a dramatic uptick in the prevalence of disease. It also resulted in the frequent experience of more severe cases of infection. Now, there's a rich corpus of photographs showing the ravages of this disease. I don't show these photographs in talks, nor do I show these photographs in my published work because of the vulnerability of their subjects, most of whom were rural, poor, and lived in a time with no structures surrounding medical consent. Because of his fame, there actually is a rich record of the medical travails of Abd al-Halim Hafiz. Somewhat ironically, one of his most beloved songs, entitled The Story of a People, was composed as an anthem for the Aswan High Dam, the same form of infrastructure that would contribute to his death. During the 1950s and 1960s, when the post-colonial state was engaged in serious endeavors to reduce the rates of schistosomiasis, it became clear that the problem of infection was twofold. Labor played a primary role in fueling the transmission of disease. The work of irrigation, it was physical work. It placed cultivators in intimate contact with the water that filled canals. The highest rates of schistosomiasis infection, both during the colonial period and during the 1950s and 1960s, were among men who performed this type of work, many of whom were first infected when they were teenagers. Irrigation pumps would eventually complement manual labor, but it proved difficult to farm without environmental contact. The disease's prevalence was also related to the infrastructure that provided or failed to provide clean water. When Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free officers took control of the Egyptian state in 1952, the vast majority of Egypt's rural villages did not have access to piped water. This situation persisted through at least the 1970s. And I want to say, we can talk about this more in the question and answer period, that since the construction of the Aswan High Dam in parts of the Nile Delta, it has again become difficult to locate and access clean water. Now, in this earlier period, the absence of piped water meant continued dependence on the water that filled canals and the pathways of disease that were associated with this water. When Gamal Abdel Nasser took power, millions were infected with schistosomiasis. The country's independence also coincided with a transformation in the global political economy of medicine. And this was a transformation that followed World War II. It was in this period that mass manufacturing and plastics made new practices of medical disposability. The war also fueled research in chemicals, and the enthusiasm that surrounded their myriad uses was immense. Finally, institutions of global public health, like the World Health Organization and also the United Nations Children's Fund, had a tremendous impact on the form that national medicine took. So did the Cold War. That schistosomiasis was prevalent did not necessarily mean that it would take center stage in the practice of Egyptian medicine. For that to happen, it had to be understood as a problem of national importance. From the time of World War I, physicians, scientists, and political actors with an eye towards Egypt were well aware of the sky-high prevalence of the disease. By the 1930s, schistosomiasis had also become a concern to large landowners in Egypt who feared that disease sapped the productivity of their laborers. When, in the 1950s, the free officers seized power, treating schistosomiasis was one piece of a broader project to remake the economy and the nation. Gamal Abdel Nasser was determined to reform politics in the countryside. His program included land reforms and agricultural initiatives. It also centered questions of rural health. Now, in the 1930s, access to schistosomiasis treatment had begun to expand. Under Nasser, in the 1950s and 1960s, it ballooned. Treatment consisted of a month-long series of injections, usually with the compound antimony potassium tartrate, which was an emetic that was intended to expel parasites and their eggs from the body. The expansion of state medicine involved the proliferation of rural clinics, like the one featured here, as well as an apparatus of state compulsion. A law mandated that citizens be treated for schistosomiasis. Access to education and some forms of employment became contingent on one's infection status, and this is a system that persists in contemporary Egypt. So did settlement in some parts of the country. Finally, mass treatment campaigns were organized in cities like Cairo and Alexandria, and also throughout rural Egypt. Schistosomiasis also assumed new global significance after World War II. In the middle decades of the 20th century, Egypt's epidemic was viewed as broadly relevant. The period between 1960 and 1970 was marked by the construction of large dams across the globe. These dams raised concerns that in areas where schistosomiasis was endemic, the transmission of the disease would spike. These concerns were indeed borne out in Brazil and Senegal and in the Ivory Coast. Now, in the face of a possible escalation in rates of disease, Egypt was a kind of quintessential case study. The WHO and UNICEF directed projects in the country during the 1950s and the 1960s. These institutions were particularly enthusiastic about the use of environmental chemicals against the snails that facilitated infection. These were vector control projects. They were also attempts to build a chemical infrastructure that might protect rural populations from disease. Now, finally, global public health institutions, from the time of their establishment, had close relationships with chemical and pharmaceutical companies. These companies were interested in testing chemicals on a wide scale in the global south before they went to market elsewhere. Many thousands of tons of chemicals were dumped in irrigation canals during the 1950s and 1960s to assess their impact on rates of disease. And I should also note that these chemicals, when used alone, did not have an impact on rates of disease. The United States military was also interested in vector-borne diseases. During World War I, the British worried that their soldiers might become infected with schistosomiasis while they were stationed in Egypt. That same trend held during World War II when American soldiers stationed in the Pacific were infected with schistosomiasis, and the American government developed an interest in the disease. This also happened again during the Vietnam War. When war ended, the US Navy established a medical research laboratory in Cairo called NAMRU 3. This laboratory had first begun operations as a kind of wartime mission to study typhus, which had devastated soldiers during World War I. During the 1950s and the 1960s, much of the research that was performed at NAMRU 3 related to vector-borne diseases, especially those that were present in the Middle East and also throughout Africa. Vectors were a primary security concern during the early Cold War. The perceived threat was that the diseases they enabled might travel beyond the places in which they were endemic and pose a threat to US interests. Now, in addition to an early interest in schistosomiasis, one of the foremost American researchers on tick-borne illnesses, an individual whose research has become newly relevant, this is Harry Hoogstraal. Harry Hoogstraal spent most of his career at NAMRU 3 in Cairo. The history that I've recounted thus far is laced with a kind of deceptive stability. I've outlined a series of linked transformations, one of the environments that surrounded the Nile River, another of the bodies of the individuals who lived and labored in these environments. Scientists and physicians thought that they understood the disease that they were treating. They thought that they grasped the geographies in which it was rooted. And yet, a world that is full of material systems is a world that is full of surprise. I began today with the notion of a common wound, this particular wound found in the liver. In the middle decades of the 20th century, the wound that was liver disease in Egypt, it both evolved and it became more common. During the first half of the 20th century, schistosoma hematomeum existed throughout Egypt. Schistosoma mansoni, on the other hand, was limited to northern and eastern portions of the Nile Delta. As it is mansoni that causes damage to the liver, the geography of the wound with which I began was initially confined to a rather small region. Specifically, by the 1950s, Egyptian physicians observed that the geographic patterns that were associated with schistosomiasis had changed. Specifically, cases of mansoni were being recorded in central Egypt, far from the regions of the Nile Delta in which the parasite had once been endemic. Local observers also recorded seeing the snails that served as the parasite's vector in these areas. It was clear that a broader environmental change was underfoot and that schistosoma mansoni was spreading. Now, mansoni would eventually overtake schistosoma hematomeum as the most common cause of schistosomiasis in Egypt. This flip-flop, it was facilitated by the slower waters of a dammed Nile River, which favored the snail species, which served as a vector for schistosoma mansoni. This change in the territories inhabited by parasites meant that liver damage also spread widely, shifting its geographies. The wound that was liver damage, this was a wound in motion, contagious, if you will, through a broader process of environmental transformation. New pathways of infectivity also complicated this story. In the middle decades of the 20th century, the injections constituted a primary experience of medicine for many Egyptians. In 1947, when cholera struck Egypt, vaccines were administered as injections. In the period that stretched from the 1930s through the early 1970s, millions of Egyptians received the multiple injections that were intended to treat schistosomiasis. Now, before World War I, injections were rare and syringes were both handmade and expensive. In the period between World War I and World War II, syringes began to be mass-produced, made from components that were interchangeable. During World War II, the manufacture of penicillin meant a dramatic increase in its production after the war. Injections proliferated, most of these injections with antibiotics, penicillin in particular. During the 1950s, single-use plastic syringes also began to be manufactured. The uptake of plastic syringes and the question of whether they were truly single-use, this was a question that was both economic and geographic. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, glass syringes continued to be used in vast swaths of the global south. Even when plastic syringes became widely available, these syringes have often been used in ways that are neither single-use nor sterile. In Egypt, as in many places across the globe, syringes moved independently of the technology that sterilized them. Autoclaves were both expensive and they were rare. This had important implications for the practice of medicine and the networks that connected human bodies to one another. In 1962, Brian Magrath, who was dean at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and a consultant for the WHO, visited Cairo, and when he was in Cairo, he described the well-oiled machine that was the state treatment program. The consultant watched in operation in the Endemic Diseases Hospital, Shubra, on November 15th, 1962. Shubra is a kind of middle-class neighborhood of Cairo. The skillful doctor began injecting at 9:20 a.m. and completed 504 injections of men, women, and children by 10:10 a.m. Allowing for a 10-minute rest, the time to give these injections was 40 minutes. The average time for each injection was thus just under 5 seconds. This remarkable performance is being repeated at various tempos all over Egypt. Injections made their own marks on the body. Antimony potassium tartrate, the compound used to treat schistosomiasis, also took a toll on the liver and damaged the organ. This was one reason that it fell out of favor during the 1970s. This damage was also likely magnified by exposure to the chemicals that were used in vector control projects. Several of these chemicals can cause liver damage. Finally, as syringes moved among patients, so did blood and what it carried. This included hepatitis viruses. It was these early injection-based therapies, schistosomiasis treatment primary among them, that enabled the wildfire spread of hepatitis C. As schistosoma mansoni moved with its characteristic patterns of liver damage, so did hepatitis C land in the liver. In fact, because the injections used to treat schistosomiasis were given intravenously, the virus traveled with ease. In the middle decades of the 20th century, hepatitis was certainly present. That said, as it had not yet been identified, and wouldn't for several decades, the damage that it caused, this was damage that was attributed to infections with schistosoma mansoni. Moreover, complicating this story, decades can pass before the effects of hepatitis C become evident. Now, what this meant is that the first group of hepatitis C cases became visible beginning in the 1960s, just as the state was increasing access to schistosomiasis treatment, with which there was also a corresponding landscape of liver damage. Now, I want to pause here and share that when I began my research for this project, I believed that Egypt's history of hepatitis C was unique. What I have discovered since doing the work for this project is the centrality of hepatitis to the history of medicine in the middle decades of the 20th century. During World War II, the US Army vaccinated its soldiers for yellow fever. Many of these soldiers became infected with the hepatitis B virus as a result of the use of syringes that were not properly sterilized. As with Magrath's observations of Egypt's treatment campaigns, urgency and scale came with a particular kind of risk. In the period that stretched between 1948 and 1963, hepatitis C transmission peaked in the United States. This transmission largely the result of unsterile medical procedures. This period preceded the introduction and spread of disposable plastic syringes. Now, I want to note here that disposability causes its own harms, both as waste and through the processes used to dispose it. Sometimes hepatitis was also spread intentionally. Students at state institutions, conscientious objectors to the war, and prisoners were among those populations deliberately infected with hepatitis in the United States in order to assess the long-term effects of the virus. These types of hepatitis experiments, they also occurred during World War II in German concentration camps. Egypt's story, it might have been unique in its scale and its intensity, but the relationship between hepatitis infection and the practice of medicine, this is a global relationship. I'm going to pause here and begin my thoughts in conclusion. I suspect that some of you might be curious whether or how the wound that I explored tonight has healed. I want to tell you that there's a book coming out about that. I also want to leave you tonight with an argument and a set of questions. The argument is this: our bodies are rich sites of history and of historical analysis. They are also objects of politics and of the economy. No matter the individual decisions that we take with regard to our health, our physical forms have been molded and will continue to be molded through environmental encounters and also through our social relations. Decisions about the structure of medical care or the orientation of medical research are never politically neutral. The history of medicine, it is that of capitalism, it is that of national and global politics, it is of the environment. In Egypt, the prevalence of a parasitic disease was fueled both by the history of capitalism and a kind of revolutionary socialism. Treatment endeavors cause their own forms of damage, this damage both chemical and viral. Medicine was an extension of the post-colonial project, something that the Nasser state understood very well. The wound on which I focused tonight, it was social, it was political, and it was economic. It was also made by a number of surprising and unanticipated material relationships that concentrated in the body at one particular site. As we look into the future, I believe that there are important questions to ask. I believe that how we answer these questions will shape not only our experiences of medicine, but our political futures. How is a changing world impacting our bodies, and how do those impacts interact with the systems that we have built? Who is valued through the orientation of our medical research? And finally, what does the practice and experience of medicine tell us about our broader politics and our priorities? With those questions, I want to conclude and thank you very much for your time tonight. And we are also opening the floor to questions.
So before you ask a question, make sure someone with a microphone is there to hand that to you, because the people that are watching this online will not be able to hear your questions without the microphone. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And do we have questions?
Yes.
Wait for a microphone.
So we have a recent history in this state of large dams, especially I'm thinking about the Kern River, but all up and down the Sierras,
Yeah.
with huge economic interest in them. And maybe you could care to talk about the medical and environmental. So you just kind of relate the Aswan Dam to all our huge dam projects here in California, if you have any thoughts on that.
Just that?
That's my main question, yeah.
So I want to start by answering this question by saying that I am not an expert in the dam projects that have been built in California. But I do think that it's really important to make an observation here, which is that because I have worked on this history that's associated with large dams, and because I'm American, one of the questions that I've asked myself, in the West, in California and Oregon, some of these dams have been taken down, right? So there's an active debate about what to do about dams and what the political stakes of those dams are. And I think one of the questions that I encounter often in my own scholarship is that that is not a debate or a conversation that has a lot of relevance in Egypt. So what is really interesting about the history of damming the Nile in Egypt is that despite the kind of public health problems and also environmental impacts that have resulted from the damming of the Nile, the dam really from the 1930s has become a non-negotiable piece of Egyptian nationalism, right? And so I think this is important because, often when I give a talk, people ask me this question like, are you for or against dams, right? Against, but that's a different kind of story. But the observation that I want to offer is that as a historian, I think it's really, really important to think with the politics of the places in which we work, right? And the politics of damming the Nile in Egypt are very much non-negotiable. They're very much central to the imagination of the nation, and they're very much imagined as central to any kinds of economic development plans that Egypt has. I will make one observation. Something that I didn't talk about this evening is when Khazen Aswan, when the first dam was built on the Nile, and when the Aswan High Dam was built on the Nile, the populations that lived south of the dam, who are mostly Nubian populations, there was a tremendous displacement, right? And so the story that I just told about the non-negotiability of the dam, there are fissures in that story, and the fissures in that story tend to map to the populations who were displaced by the dam and whose way of life was lost. But even that story, it has become more complicated as the current authoritarian Egyptian state has gone to great lengths to both invest in those regions of southern Egypt and kind of shift the politics associated with a dammed Nile. So this is all to say that I know a lot about the politics of damming the Nile in Egypt, and also about some of those debates in a broad sense in the West, but I would love to talk to you more about how we see kind of comparisons between questions of medicine and public health in these areas. Donna.
Oh, we had someone. Shall I ask while Donna's getting the mic?
Zach.
Thank you so much. And well, I'll be quick, how about? And I'm thinking back to Jenny's introduction in framing this movement away from a progress narrative in the history of science.
Yeah.
And one thing that was really striking to me is a word that I didn't hear you use is unintentional versus intentional consequences.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a little bit and how you're thinking more relationally in telling these stories and moving away from that, like, that kind of traditional way?
That's a great question. I'm very glad you asked that question. So oftentimes, I didn't think about intentionality in my talk tonight, and I'm going to tell you why. But there was another word I also didn't use, which is iatrogenic, right? So iatrogenic is a term that refers to how we are harmed by medicine and medical procedures. And usually, when commentators tell the story of hepatitis C infection in Egypt, they use the idea of iatrogenic harm, which is bound up with these notions of intentionality. I think that for me, as a historian of science, those notions of intentionality, I think they're important to think with and to think through when we are trying to imagine the worlds that scientists have imagined. That said, I also think that they come attached to a particular set of values and a particular kind of, I'm going to use the word ignorance about the complexity of material relationality that is not generally how I approach my work, right? So I really do try to think with the worlds that scientists imagined and how they thought their knowledge systems would play into those worlds. However, I think that as historians, we need to think with historical development and material relations rather than get caught up in this notion of a kind of progress narrative and what scientists intended the world to look like, right? So I'm much more interested in describing what the world does look like.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was seriously helpful. I've got a couple of streams of questions, but answering only one.
I would expect nothing
The one
less.
that you can't, the interaction of all of this with the history of mosquito-borne diseases.
Yeah.
In Timothy Mitchell's story, but leave that to the side. I'm really more interested in the interaction of schistosomiasis and hepatitis C with questions of bearing children, childbirth, child health, and the questions of birth defects from the chemicals used to treat the diseases, and to what degree the questions of the health of mothers and children. When do they come into view, and how do they come into view, and what about the burden of disease in these materialities you're talking about?
Okay, I'm gonna try to break that question down into several different parts. The first observation that I would make is that to a certain extent, it was not only men who were infected with schistosomiasis and hepatitis C, but there is a gendering to this kind of wounding and this kind of infection because of the realities of agricultural labor. And what I mean by that is that this also happened to women. Men tended to be infected in higher numbers. And so much of the kind of biomedical literature focuses on the impact of that interaction in men who were agricultural laborers, right? So there's a lot about gender that we do not know in this history. One comment that I would make is that one of the developments that happens, especially with hepatitis C transmission, is that in the early years of hepatitis C transmission, most people are being infected via injection-based treatments. However, as the prevalence of hepatitis C rises, and as access to medicine also rises, especially with the Nasser estate's attempts to build out a kind of social welfare system, one of the things that we see is that hepatitis C begins to cross its traditional class boundaries. It also moves across gender lines in some really interesting ways, right? So I would say that in the 1950s and 1960s, this kind of intersection that I talked about was overwhelmingly male, but that really starts to shift in the 1970s and 1980s, especially with relation to hepatitis C. In addition to that, many women are infected with hepatitis C through childbirth, especially if they receive any kind of blood transfusion, right? I want to offer a kind of another observation that I hope answers your question, because I'm having to come at it from the side. And that is that, one of the issues with which I have wrestled in my book is that I have a tremendous archive of these chemical vector control campaigns that were organized during the 1950s and 1960s. What I don't have, and there's a real reason for this, and there's a rich kind of body of thought within science studies that thinks about this, is that there are not kind of bounded studies that measure the impact of chemicals on the bodies of those who lived in the ecologies where they were used, right? So there's a lot about these chemicals that we know in the abstract, and from cases of chemical poisoning, there's a lot that we don't know about these chemicals when they are used at scale. And so I think the question that you ask about childbirth and about gender is a really important one. And I think that in some ways, we can answer pieces of that question. There are also answers to that question that we will never have, right? I mean, there's also, of course, a kind of messiness to these overlapping patterns in the wound, right? We're dealing with a pattern of injury that's caused by multiple pathogens and also sets of unquantified environmental exposures. And that applies both with injection-based treatment and also with these environmental chemicals that we're using. And so I think there's a lot that we don't know about these questions of childbirth and how it might impacted women. Also, I mean, in the 1950s and the 1960s, when this was a question of class, the vast majority of rural women were giving birth at home, right? I have not seen literature on that, but I would not be surprised if that indeed were something that was observed.
Question here.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. The High Aswan Dam formed an enormous lake that extended into Nubia.
Yes.
Did this spread the disease into Nubia as a result of it?
So that's a great question. I'm going to give you a couple of different answers to that. So the lake that formed south of the Aswan High Dam, Lake Nasser, that was a lake that became an active site of research by public health institutions after the dam was built, right? So there's a kind of broader question that institutions like the WHO are wrestling with, and that is this question of what happens in man-made lakes, especially in which we see areas that parasitic diseases are endemic. And so what happens after the high dam is built is that the Egyptian government goes to great lengths to try to keep schistosomiasis out of that lake, right? So fishermen that fish on that lake have to be given licenses by the state to fish. Those licenses are dependent on one being free of schistosomiasis infection. That kind of pairs with something that we see happen in an earlier period in which, as the Egyptian government is building new agricultural settlements, in order to settle in these settlements, you have to prove that you don't have schistosomiasis, okay? These are public health measures that mostly do not work to control the spread of disease. There certainly is schistosomiasis in Sudan, right? And that disease is associated with a set of dams that were built independently in Sudan, separate from the Aswan High Dam. But interestingly enough, when I've interviewed Egyptian physicians, one of the questions that they have posed to me is that there's something very particular about Egypt's epidemic of hepatitis C, and we don't see that in Sudan, despite the existence of injection-based schistosomiasis treatment campaigns, right? So that's a question in which physicians still kind of wrestle with and can't answer, right? So there is a different, and surely the answer to that question is a complex one, but there is a different landscape of disease in Sudan, but this problem of schistosomiasis is shared and also shifts after the high dam is built because of the changed kind of riparian landscape.
Thanks for that great lecture. If the building of the dam is off the table as a node of public discussion about this, if dams are taken for granted, what is the public discourse like around the series of interlinked catastrophes you've talked about here? What does the conversation look like in any sector, politics, medical, popular discourse? Can you fill in a little of that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're also going to make me tell you the end of the story, right? So, well, I'll start sort of in an earlier period. So during the 1950s and 1960s, there's this kind of tension in the discourse around schistosomiasis. On the one hand, because the disease is endemic, and because in the kind of colonial period, evidence of the disease was found in ancient Egyptian mummies, every single public health publication, many of them contemporary, will begin with a statement of the ancient nature of schistosomiasis, right? So there's a way in which the history of capitalism is always written out of that story. And indeed, schistosomiasis was endemic, but it was a very different kind of experience and very different kind of disease. But that tension also kind of animates the debates that exist within the field of medicine in Egypt in the 1950s and the 1960s, right? So this is a kind of deeply modernist, deeply hopeful moment in which schistosomiasis is seen as a problem of colonialism, as a problem of underdevelopment. The dam is non-negotiable. And so when construction on the Aswan High Dam begins, that is also the period in which there is like an incredible increase in the resources that are being devoted to schistosomiasis treatment, right? So there is this idea that it's unfortunate, but we're going to treat our way out of it. And in this moment of the kind of like optimism of high modernism, that seems possible. Now, eventually, by the time we get to the 1980s, schistosomiasis is not a problem in Egypt in a contemporary moment. And that is a really complicated story that is linked to the development of a therapeutic that can be taken orally and is less toxic in the body. That therapeutic can be manufactured generically, okay? So it's incredibly inexpensive. Also, these changing patterns of agricultural labor, but also rural to urban migration really shift the landscape of disease, right? And so what we see is that by the time the 1980s comes, people are being infected with schistosomiasis in lower numbers, in part because of urbanization, and in part because of the kind of like perpetuation of these measures to fight the disease. And so in many ways, the kind of modernist optimism, which I'm usually not someone to express, eventually that disease, it disappears in many ways from the Egyptian landscape. That said, there is always a kind of fear that the drug used to treat schistosomiasis now and preventatively, praziquantel, that resistance will develop to that drug. And also, of course, when we treat people in these ways, we attach our bodies to particular industrial systems of production without which they cannot be healthy, right? And so there is a kind of, I'm going to add one more piece of this story, which is not only does the Egyptian government and the WHO kind of treat itself out of schistosomiasis, but they adopt a very, very similar strategy to treat hepatitis C. So, 15 years ago, Gilead Sciences developed a therapeutic that effectively treated hepatitis C, and it was particularly effective against genotype 4 of the disease, which is the genotype that's prevalent in Egypt. Gilead was very enthusiastic to test the drug in Egypt. The drug was very expensive. And so what unfolded is the kind of last chapter of my book, in which Gilead and the Egyptian government negotiate to bring the drug to Egypt. The Egyptian government eventually denies Gilead's patent application on some fairly credible grounds. And Gilead goes with it, both because they want to see the drug used and because the drug is quite easy to reverse engineer. Now, I bring up the Hep C story because one of the kind of historical developments that I would note is that the strategy of the post-colonial Egyptian government to deal with health has been one of disease elimination of these large diseases. And that has certainly had a positive impact on the lives of many people. But I would also be remiss if I did not note that the structures of Egyptian medicine remain deeply difficult. Medicine is something that is very hard for people to access. Interestingly enough, medicine in Egypt has always been partially privatized, even through the kind of Nasserist heyday of the 1950s and the 1960s. And so what we see is this kind of tension between medicine as disease elimination versus medicine as a more robust system of care.
All right, so thanks so much, Jen, and such a wonderful talk, full of insights. And I also want to thank you publicly for the generous ways you've contributed to global and community health at the university. Special lecture during COVID that you prepared for a course on COVID that was online, all online, to serving on the executive committee, representing the humanities. So many generous ways you collaborate, so thank you for all of that. And it was embodied in the talk, just as you showed that pathologies of power become embodied in wounds of various sorts. And I had a specific question for you around vectors in this regard.
Yeah.
Because you do a really clear job of showing how limited, narrow, the sort of militaristic vector control mindset is and what its repercussions are in rolling out these kinds of biochemical kind of interventions to do vector control. And then you sort of took us on this journey that ended up, like in your answer to Gail just now as well, talking about a different kind of medicine, ultimately saying, like, in a way, well, this is my question to you, can you flip vector control around when you reimagine it socially, historically, politically, the way you have, and imagine all these vectors running through social power relations becoming, embodied in embodied pathologies? When you do that, which is what you were effectively doing, does that open up opportunities for doing medicine and public health differently? And have you seen, where are the windows for that you've actually seen, like, progressive public health folk in Egypt seize those opportunities?
I'm thinking about that question for a moment. Well, I want to make a few observations. I think that one observation that I would make about vector control more broadly, and I want this to be a part of the conversation, is I think that, to go back to Zach's question about intentionality, I think that often when historians have imagined vector control projects, we think about the use of chemicals in time and place, and not the afterlives that thousands of tons of chemicals left in the environment, interacting in novel ways, degrading in ways that we haven't anticipated. We don't always consider those questions. And so I think that with questions of vector control, one of the things that I think about in my work is this question of time frame. So a question that I ask myself is, what does it mean to ask a question about the history of medicine? And what does it mean to think within a particular time frame? Vector control to me feels like oftentimes in the literature and the historiography, we've not been working within the right frame of time, right? And so when I think now about Egypt and some of the projects that I think have been most progressive in the realm of public health, I think some of those projects have been projects that were deeply rooted in the communities that they were seeking to impact, right? So, you know, the context that I was talking about today, this is a high authoritarian context of the 1950s and the 1960s. These were top-down projects to the nth degree. And I think that, you know, there have been some really successful public health campaigns in Egypt, one of them related to Hep B vaccination, in which, you know, public health education, it extended to universities, it extended to students. There was a kind of prolonged effort to build relationships and to build medical trust in a way that would eventually produce better medical outcomes, right? And so I think that the projects that I tend to be drawn to, the projects that I think about as more progressive, are less bounded in time and more focused on the ways that we build community. You know, I will also say that I have a real skepticism of the public health history that I study, in the sense that these were programs that were implemented to make the violence of capitalism just that much more livable. And I wonder where those programs end, right? Is that the revolutionary world that we want, or do we want something better for our health and for our bodies?
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful.